Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to this week's episode of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and I am very happy to introduce this week's guest, Leah McGrath Goodman. She is an investigative journalist currently working on her third book and in her final year for a master's degree in corruption analysis and governance from the Center for the Study of Corruption at the University of Sussex. Hello, sweetie.
Hello. Yeah, it's very cool to study at the Center for the Study of Corruption. It sounds very like what's going on over there.
Mm-hmm. And that's over in the UK. So I take it you're doing this. Is this an online course or are you low residency or?
Oh my gosh, I would love to finish it like in some level of residency, but right now I'm doing it from afar and I will be going over there hopefully before graduation, but graduation isn't that far off now. So
Mm-hmm. It's coming
Um,
fast.
yeah, and it's definitely been a labor of love. I didn't even know there was a Center for the Study of Corruption, but as an investigative journalist, when you investigate corruption fairly regularly, and it's sometimes really complicated what you're working on, you're like, how do other people who aren't journalists tackle this stuff? And I just was so intrigued when I saw there's like this whole like global discipline with academics around how we look at, measure, define, and study corruption.
Well, one reason I wanted you on the show, even though there's nothing right now happening at the legislature that directly corresponds to this conversation, what I find so fascinating is when you and I were talking about corruption, it kept coming back to this thought of a break in the public trust. And in a state like Vermont and in these small rural communities, so much of our governance pretty much rests on public trust. And it just made me think of how vulnerable we could be. And it does seem a lot when you look at the news, embezzlement here, embezzlement there, these small organizations, that type of thing. And so thank you for being here, Leah, to talk about this today. And I'd love to start with so we're all on the same page, a definition of what corruption actually is.
So one of the things that I found the most interesting about defining corruption when I started out, on the scholarly side of the study of corruption, as opposed to the investigative journalism side, was that there is not academic agreement over the definition. In fact, every study on corruption actually has to show high up in the study, this is how we're defining corruption for
Oh,
purposes of this
interesting.
study, because um, a lot of people want to argue about it, and which bothered me immensely because, again, as a journalist, I'm like, can't we just agree so I can write something like, that guy's corrupt because he met the definition of corruption? But to relieve everyone in your audience about like, okay, well, where does that leave us? Um, the most simple and sort of straightforward definition that most people are sort of working with, most academics and others who are, staying updated on this, is Transparency International's definition. And they put out something called the Corruption Perceptions Index, like annually, and look at different issues in the world and in different countries. And they call it the Perceptions Index as opposed to Proven Corruption Index, because
Hmm.
corruption is by nature hidden. And so a lot of what they measure is what people think is happening in whatever country they live in or whatever region they're in. And so that's why it's the Corruption Perceptions Index. But that's a whole other that's getting into how do you even prove corruption, or we don't even have a agreed upon definition of corruption. So leaves us kind of behind the eight ball before we even get started. But
Yeah. Yeah. How do you call someone out on it if you can't agree on what it is?
right. So for purposes of having something, Transparency International simply defined it as corruption is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Entrusted power can be public officials who are entrusted with power. It can also be officials at a private company or corporation, but frequently in the study of corruption, that we're seeing sort of globally, a lot of it does focus on public officials' behavior and
Mhm.
whether or not they are using their power for private gain. But it does extend to non-public officials and just entrusted officers at a company or directors, or could even be the manager in your job. Like, are they using their power in a proper way, a trustworthy way, or are they abusive with it or exploitative with it, or are they even trying to gain from it? Private gain is defined pretty loosely as it could be money and
Mhm.
payments. It could also be favors. I mean, when we saw the Clarence Thomas scandal, the Supreme Court justice who was exposed earlier last year, he was actually accepting these like flights on private jets and these very lavish trips um, and hotel, and golf course type, junkets with all these very wealthy people. And so it can be something that allows you to have something, luxurious, or it could even be, in his case, remember there was one of his benefactors paid for a relative's boarding school. And
Mm.
that was very much hidden until, somebody over at ProPublica, the media organization, dug up, oh, you know, he's actually having people pay for boarding school for people in his family. And he's saying, oh, it's just a gift, but I mean,
Mhm.
it's not good when you're a public official that are entrusted with something, especially a Supreme Court justice, right? So
Mhm.
those are examples of concerns where an academic might say, these have badges of corruption, or they show flags of corruption. Hard to say you can definitively prove it with any given example until someone's actually convicted, right?
Mhm.
Like in a court of law, which is part of the reason why journalists have such a hard time writing about corruption, because we can't just say that guy's corrupt or that woman's corrupt, like, because they're not convicted yet. And so
Mhm.
how we write about it and how we measure it and talk about it's important. And that's basically the definition of, and once again, the abuse of entrusted power for private gain.
Mhm. Oh, I
Yeah.
like that. Thank you, Leah, for running through that. How about, what are some useful okay, I'm gonna back up. I appreciate that definition, and my next question, it will kind of dovetail because one thing I think about corruption is often we might recognize it when we see it, or like the
Mm.
perception index says, you might perceive that it's there, but we don't always all call it the same thing. And
Yeah.
sometimes we're like, well, was that really the wrong thing to do? Maybe there's actually bigger benefits from one person's corruption. What
Yes.
are some
Which sounds insane when you really
it,
think about it. Yeah.
well, yeah, it does. But a community that's struggling might appreciate someone coming in and building a new factory, even if that factory is for deceitful ends or something, as long as those paychecks are coming through.
Mhm.
People who need resources need resources.
Yes. Yes.
So, in your studies and your work, what are some concepts that you have found helpful to understanding kind of like different ways people approach corruption or define it or work with it?
So I think kind of what you touched on there is it's an interesting concept of, and it is discussed in academia, is this idea of, can corruption be good? Is there such a thing as good corruption? Good with quotes around it,
Hmm.
obviously. But we talked a little at the beginning of this episode about how public officials may be seen to embezzle or do any number of things. We live in a state where frequently the salaries can be quite low versus the expenses people are facing day to day, especially with inflation now.
Hmm.
Um, when you have communities in deep need, it's not just tempting for individuals to maybe want to put their hand in the till, but it's also tempting for a community to maybe get cozy with a newcomer who has money and is investing in all sorts of things. And they might not know what the source of that money is. They may not know where this person's money is coming from, but they know, oh, he's investing in our nonprofit, or she's donating to this other cause, or maybe they're going to buy a giant piece of land and make it into something that we all needed. And we've had things like that. You and I have talked many times about different projects we've seen where someone will come in and just refurbish. And there are opportunity zones. It's really a designation out here that can get you tax
Mhm.
cuts if you buy something in an opportunity zone or you're working with an opportunity zone. So a lot of people coming in with money, they may be coming in with good investable money that has very clean sources, or they made their own money, or they had a job and made a lot of money. Some of them might be coming in with money from other places. And sometimes you need to put that money somewhere so that it's not looking like it's coming from the wrong place. And now you're putting it into a business, and
Are you
you
saying
kind of,
shady money?
yeah, like money laundering, where you
Yeah.
have to hide the source of your money. And if you, for example, robbed a bank and you ran off with $1 million, you would be sitting there like, now, if you went to a different bank with $1 million in cash, you would probably not be leaving that bank of your own recognizance.
Mm-mm.
You would probably be leaving with a few people walking with you.
With bright, shiny silver handcuffs.
Yeah, so, when a community in need is vulnerable to those sorts of elements. However, a lot of times communities and whole countries may decide we're going to get into bed with this not so good, shady individual or group of people,
Mhm.
because they're going to do something that it's in an ends justify the means situation.
Mhm.
Whole communities can potentially just be silent because they'll be happy with the new jobs or the new factory, as you pointed out, or right now we know in Putney, Vermont, it's paper mill, is it?
Mhm. Mhm.
Who's going to buy it? Can
Mm.
we be picky about who buys it if it means saving jobs? And that's where some of this stuff can get complicated when we talk about good corruption. Somebody may come in and they may have good money, they may have bad money, they may have good intentions, they may have bad intentions, but sometimes when a community is in need, they're not so focused on that as much as keeping those jobs, keeping that business.
Mhm.
So that's one sort of corruption concept. And there are a couple others we wanted to talk about, which were free riding and false preferences. And I'm not
Mhm.
sure which one you want to talk about first.
Oh, let's do false preferences.
Okay. All right. So these are two sort of, I consider these almost like bookends. Um, this is not an academic viewpoint, it's my own viewpoint. Um, so as we are moving toward what might be a very scary election cycle here in the
Mhm.
United States, and this is as an example, I have really been watching in particular how we have leaders both on the Democratic and Republican side, national leaders, who really did seem to disagree, and it's becoming very polarized.
Mhm.
Um, but there's some things that we know poll very much in the majority. Most Americans are for reproductive rights, for example.
Mhm.
Even in places that are very conservative, most do still want to have access to reproductive care, and even things like access to IVF and being able to have children if they're having trouble, and assisted reproductive technologies, things like that. So that pulls very well, but we also know that there's, a lot of people in this country who may not openly acknowledge that they want to do that, because politically, if you're a national leader and your party leans the other way, you have to act as though you don't agree, or you have
Mhm.
to be silent about it. And so I love this concept of false preferences, because it basically means you seem like you either are okay with something or you're going along with something, but you actually don't personally agree with it, but you're doing it for political reasons.
Mhm.
Um, Now we have national leaders doing that right now, and I think it's very cowardly. We all do that sometimes. Like if you're at a conference or a cocktail party, and or just even with friends who you like, and you realize, oh my God, everybody in this room believes in this thing. that I think is insane. And you just like decide, I just better not say anything, like I'm not trying to like disrupt a good evening or argue with anyone. And I mean,
Everyone loves the boyfriend except you. And then they break
yeah,
up and you find out nobody liked the boyfriend.
right. It doesn't even need to be political. It could just be social. It could just be, but your false preferences basically, they basically mean that I have this little thing I kind of wrote up for this particular podcast. So I remember, false preferences is when people purport to support an idea or a person, like, Fox News's former anchor Tucker Carlson, everyone loved him until they all hated him, or,
Hmm.
um, even like a Vladimir Putin, we're seeing this weird movement in this country where people seem to like him. And then, some people seem open to being fans of Vladimir Putin.
Hmm.
And so in social theory, the tipping point for when people feel supported in changing their minds is very individualistic and unpredictable.
Hmm.
But it matters because it is correlated with when they perceive everyone else to be changing their minds. So if you think everyone else is changing their minds about like Donald Trump or Vladimir Putin or Joseph Biden, our current president, you may finally admit, oh, I really hated him the whole time. And it's how what is perceived as a wide consensus can just suddenly unravel, is
Hmm.
when you have a lot of people pretending to back or just kind of silently backing an idea or a person. And in the end, it turns out a lot less people believed in it than you thought. And when they perceive everyone else also doesn't believe in it, they all back off immediately, and whatever support that thing had just collapses.
Hmm.
And that's a false preference. A
And
great example of that is like when the Berlin Wall came down,
mhm.
when Germans were actually yanking it down, the same people who had been guarding the wall, now we could see that the whole time that many of them didn't support it at all and couldn't wait to bring it down.
Mhm. And what does that mean, false preferences for, say, corruption? Is that an example of, say, there's a governor or a prime minister or a president or a program, let's say a program
Mhm,
that's
mhm.
corrupt and everybody seems to support it, and then enough people say, no, we don't. And
Yeah.
it shifts the support, and then that program might fall apart or that person's leadership may just fall apart.
Yeah, it can be a wall,
Mhm.
it can be a person, it could be a policy, it can be any of those things. Anything people would have to more or less appear to support for it to continue to happen or to
Mhm.
to just exist. And I think what I love about false preferences and corruption is part of corruption is the study of how do you create change,
Mhm.
because corruption is often not just um, it's often more than anything else a social construct. If you don't have people agreeing to go along with a thing, if you don't have people who are supporting that thing, it can unravel quite quickly. And
Mhm.
when studying corruption, there's a lot of focus on things like how do we challenge things that are corrupt or leaders who are corrupt, and how do we follow that sort of social tipping point of when the masses suddenly decide, actually, we're not going to put up with this anymore. We're not doing this anymore, and we're not agreeing to this. And I don't mind going along with something else. But a lot of times people don't feel brave enough to do that until they think everyone else is ready to do that. And that's why false preferences matter. It's like they are strongly correlated with people changing their minds when they perceive everyone else is also changing their minds.
Mhm.
And I just love that as social theory to me is so interesting and how group dynamics work.
Mhm. I can
And
imagine too, like you use the phrase changing minds, but I suspect in some cases it's also perceptions of safety. Like
Mhm.
people
Yeah,
suddenly feel safe to voice their real opinion.
absolutely. If you think you're going to abandon your friends or your colleagues or your community and your view, you are going to be much more likely to not be open about that view, right? You're going to
Mhm.
hide that view. Um, that's a social thing, and that's a getting along with others thing too. A lot of people will think about this every day. And do I need to tell everybody I don't like that or I disagree? No, you don't have to tell everyone every single thought you have. Some thoughts matter more than others. So the other part of how like social theory plays in to corruption, I think can be quite interesting is this idea of free riding, which is sort of the third concept I wanted to share with you all today.
Mhm.
And this is also has to do with group dynamics. It traces back to, weirdly, traces as far back as the 17th century
Hmm.
and modes of thought tracing back that far. And it's from collective action theory. Um, I think it was this US economist in the 1960s named Mancur Olson
Mhm.
who noticed that members of a group will frequently choose not to pursue a collective action that achieves the public good, even though it is clearly in their favor to do so. And the reason why is they will instead look at the situation and decide, I will free ride on others' efforts to achieve those good, positive goals. But I won't participate because I don't have time. I don't want to argue with anybody. I don't want to put in the effort. It's too, costly to me or my reputation or whatever's going on. Um, and in this way, they will act in their own self-interest, but the results tend to be suboptimal for everyone because what happens is only a small group of people end up moving to work the needle. And even if it's to a positive goal, everyone benefits when the goal is reached, but only some people have expended themselves doing it.
Hmm.
So that's called free riding. And I love this concept because it makes me think about anytime any of us see a major, some big stride forward
Mhm.
in our public life or in our political life or in our just our day-to-day lives because of other people's efforts. We're actually free riding
Mm.
off them and benefiting from them.
Mhm.
I mean, we can't all do everything, but it's important to sort of appreciate that um, group dynamics are very interesting like that, and that whole groups will decide not to bother doing something, while other groups will say like, no way, we're gonna put our foot down. And this again is how like change can happen, right? Like in corruption studies, this idea of how does change happen? Well, enough people decide they're going to push back, and those who didn't will end up will end up benefiting. But the idea is that it is suboptimal for only some people. It's not good. Those people might become exhausted, or
Mhm.
they may lose opportunities themselves while they're pushing for this goal. So I think in some ways it's a good reminder, especially watching our political landscape today. It's a good reminder of noticing if any of us are free riding or if we could lend a hand now and then with a cause that's very important.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think in small town or small communities, the correlation may be there's always 3 or 4 people who show up to volunteer, and they might be the reason the library has story hour that
Mhm.
so many little children benefit from. But
Yes.
there's really only 3 people carrying it.
Right.
And the lack of volunteers that are really needed in communities sometimes.
Yeah. I think it also, one of the things that I love about these studies that of corruption is a lot of corruption studies are also about anti-corruption. And so it's
Hmm.
about how do we make the world a better place? How do we understand what makes, a lot of it is like debated about how do you actually make it better without making it worse? Because
Mhm.
a lot of times change requires some level of fighting or disagreement before you get to the goal. And so a lot of people don't like that phase, understandably,
Yeah.
and don't want to be a part of it. Or they just don't want to, as you pointed out, they just don't want to put in the energy, even if it's something as simple as who's going to be in charge of story hour.
Right, right.
Yeah, like obviously that doesn't require a fight, but it still requires people care enough to do something or to be a part of something.
Mhm,
I'm a big fan of do what you can. Like, don't do more than you can, but do whatever you can within whatever you are able. And some people have more bandwidth than others. I think that the main thing is to remember, like, no one expects anyone to overextend, and no one should, because if you become exhausted, then you can't do anything for anybody.
mhm,
You just really have to figure out, like, what is my scope of contribution that is comfortable for me? And then what do I want to contribute to that would potentially make a big difference,
mhm.
as opposed to small differences, like arguing with, you know, your neighbor about, a boundary line or something. It's not actually terribly helpful. Yeah.
I think what I'm sitting with right now, before we head to break, is so often in the stories of corruption, I think we often focus on like one or two corrupt people.
Hmm.
And the concepts you shared, the free riding, for example, it it just reminds me how systemic something like corruption or anti-corruption can be, and how we are all operating within that system for better or for worse. And what are we allowing, what are we not allowing,
Yes,
as a group, as a community, is sort of what I'm sitting with right now.
absolutely. Because if people speak up early and check each other, right, which you can do best socially, right, before anyone ends up in court or on some really bad, track. There's all these social and also familial things, right? If you're raised in a family and then your friends, your community, your neighbors, your school, all those things. If people are like checking you, hopefully in a caring way, but are like keeping an eye on you and are, we do act as checks and balances for each other. And there's a really strong social component there.
Mhm,
If those things are missing, somebody can go way off into the wild blue horizon and, go way off track before anybody actually pulls them in or reins them in. It may do a lot of damage and they may end up in a lot of trouble.
mhm.
And groups, that applies to groups too, right? Like we've seen in the last like few decades, we've seen whole like multinational companies convicted like as a company, right? Of
Right.
horrific wrongdoing where they're like the whole company's convicted, like they didn't want to convict the CEO, so they're like, we'll just convict the whole company. And it's like, that's a huge company. Are you just saying everyone at the company is like bad? Like it's like a weird concept, right? But it can
Mhm,
apply to large groups of people, these ideas. Um,
mhm.
yeah.
Well, thank you, Leah. So everyone stay tuned. The Montpelier Happy Hour on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro will return after we hear from some underwriters. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the Montpelier Happy Hour. And if you're just joining me, I'm speaking with Leah McGrath Goodman, who is an investigative journalist and is also getting her master's in corruption from the University of Sussex in England, or the UK, or Great Britain, or however you would like to call it. We want to thank Brattleboro Community Television for taking the video version of our show and sharing it with media centers around the state. And since Emily Kornheiser cannot join us today, it falls to me to remind everyone that the views and opinions of the hosts and the guests at the happy hour belong just to us. They don't belong to the radio station. They don't belong to any of the platforms where the show may appear. They don't belong to any of the media centers. They don't belong to our house pets or our house plants. Just us. Did you get that, Leah?
Yes, I think my houseplants are going to be quite upset, but
They
not my
wanted to have
animals.
their opinions too.
Right.
So if you're just joining us, Leah and I have been talking about corruption, and in the first half of the show, we went into some of the deep dives around definitions and some of the different concepts when people are studying corruption. And Leah, in this second half, I'd like to turn it a little bit more to Vermont, make it a little more local. And partly because I was re-listening to a 2016 episode of Brave Little State from Vermont Public,
Mhm.
where they actually looked at, someone wrote in and said, is Vermont just like this crazy place for embezzlement? It feels like every time I turn on the news, some town clerk has embezzled, some volunteer at an animal shelter has embezzled something, this, that, and the other thing. And I will link to the episode in the show notes of this podcast, folks, because it was very interesting what the reporters found out and what they found out about data. And at the time, there really actually, in some ways, wasn't a lot of great data to talk about embezzlement, specifically in Vermont. But there was one quote from a Dr. Weber from the crime research group that I think ties into what Leah said in the first half of the show, that embezzlement gets a lot of news coverage because it involves a violation of public trust, and that's hurtful to the community. And so I just thought that all tied in a little bit to what we were talking about. So, Leah, let's bring this home. Let's bring this to Vermont a little bit.
Mhm.
In your work, what are some of the local cases maybe you've looked at for your studies?
So I would just say, as a journalist, I've definitely kept, very close tabs on what happens in this area. And, you know, I I'm sort of a refugee from writing about finance on Wall Street and writing about these really high level financial shenanigans that can involve millions and billions of dollars. But what's interesting, and Olga, you and I have talked about this, we'll see something developing live sometimes, Olga and I, and the person won't even be convicted yet, but it's
Mhm.
already throwing off all the bad signs.
All the red flags are going, "Wee, look at me."
Right. And I will name one here because it did result in a conviction. In April 2021, it was Seth Andrew from Democracy Builders who bought Marlborough College for
Campus.
$250,000 in cash and an assumption of a $1.5 million debt. But then it turned out, according to the Department of Justice, alleged that he had stolen it from a charter school network he had started called Democracy Prep,
Mhm.
and that by April 2021, he was arrested and charged with wire fraud, money laundering, and making false statements to a financial institution. Some of the money, I believe, was to bankroll a piece of real estate, an apartment in New York City.
Yeah, he used the money to basically, if I remember the FBI's press release correctly, to inflate his personal wealth on paper so
Mhm.
that he could get a better mortgage on an apartment.
Yeah, and I remember looking at how many basis points less he like saved on that purchase. And I remember thinking the risk he was taking versus the amount of money he saved was, I mean, the risk was just massive compared to, I mean, it literally looked like a coupon clipping that
Mhm.
he was doing.
Ouch.
Certainly, if you take out a 30-year like mortgage on something, over time, basis points do add up. But the personal risk and the fact that he was, ultimately, charged by the Department of Justice in a criminal action. He also was alleged to have embezzled $218,000 from bank accounts controlled by Democracy Prep Public
Yeah.
Schools, the school network so it was. But what I want to say about this, this is one case. It was pretty extraordinary. I think the whole community was like, wow, wow, this is a beloved college. Many people who live here either lived, worked, or graduated from Marlborough. I have a lot of friends who went to Marlborough, friends who've taught there,
Mhm.
worked there. I think what I found interesting was Olga and I noticed early on in the Marlboro College transaction, we were looking at the financials. We were just looking at what was in the newspaper. Remember? And we were
Mhm.
like, well, wait a minute. How is he going to pay this $1.5 million debt? I mean, it looks like he barely managed to scrape together the cash for the first part of this transaction. He had a
Mhm.
business partner who looked like he was a bartender who lived in Toronto, right? It was
Yeah,
like
that was a
a
whole part of the
weird dude.
story. Jeff Potter, and some of the community members hunted that person up. And I don't remember what came of it, but yes, it was strange, which is such a shame because the concept behind Democracy Builders was actually really good. And Seth had surrounded himself with some really great people,
That's
and
the
it
sad
fell
thing.
apart. Yeah.
Yes. I mean, that's incredibly, that's a good point that you're making because while we can all sit here and like be like, and then that weird guy who you would ask to guard the kegger, who was the bartender guy, who I believe he ran from you guys when you reached out to him. That's what I heard. I heard he like hid, which, when there's a $1.5 million debt in a transaction that's on the line, and one of the key business partners mentioned in the news article is hiding before it's even closed, not a good sign. There's just a lot of things that were not good signs. Um, that regular people could have seen themselves. And remember, Olga, you and I were talking about it, and we were like, why is this being like, who decided this was going to be a good deal or this wasn't going to fall
Hmm.
apart? And it's not that we were prescient, it was that we were just looking at it. It looked really bad.
Hmm.
Um, but your point about the people, the collateral damage, which is
Yeah.
other people who actually have something to offer, who are worthwhile, who are highly talented, and thought there was something great that might happen and they wanted to be a part of it, and then they got thrown back because of it.
Hmm.
My understanding is that Seth Andrew himself is a very talented, or was seen to be a very talented person,
Hmm. I
skills
think
wise.
by many people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the fact that this happened, also unfortunate, waste of his own talent and time. I think he went to prison for, I believe it was something like a year and a day or
Yeah.
something. He should be out by now. I don't know if he is, but you might know that, Olga.
I believe he is because he pled guilty in 2022.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. That's a local case. The other Department of Justice case that caught my eye over this past year had to do with world learning. SIT is sort of, one of our beloved institutions here in
yeah.
Brattleboro. Full disclosure, both Olga and I have done work for SIT. Were you an employee like at SIT yourself?
Yeah, I was a Janeway scholar, so I was a experimenter in high school when on one of their programs, and then I worked in Res Life, and then I
Okay.
worked in study abroad. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, and I was also at SIT doing work for some time. I was their head writer and editor for a while. And then
Mhm.
my mother did the experiment
Oh,
in
no way.
Florence. Yeah, she did it. She was back then it applied to, yeah, she was in university at the time that she did the experiment back then.
Hmm.
She went to Florence to, she's an artist and she studied in Florence for the under the SIT experiment. And I was like, wow,
That's
I had no
cool.
idea like that my own mom had done that with SIT. Anyway, very sad because it's an important part of our community. But the director, the head of human resources, really the vice president of human resources, was um, found to have committed wire fraud, and also the World Learning lost over $400,000 because she was involved in moving money around improperly and to benefit herself, and she had to end up paying a lot of that back. But the DOJ was involved, and I believe, she's now finishing finishing paying it back, and also um, complying with the DOJ's demands. And this is also another criminal case. And so,
Hmm.
you know, it's very frightening when, in your own community, you're seeing high levels of fraudulent behavior that is, amounting to hundreds of thousands of dollars that are either leaving an institution that's a beloved institution, or, Marlboro also, same thing, beloved
Mhm.
institution. Um, it's really lamentable, and a lot of it requires us to reflect afterward, asking, culturally, are there things we could have done? Are there things we could have noticed? Are there things that maybe we should have asked? I
Mhm.
think sometimes we're so eager, Marlboro College needed a benefactor, and, Seth
Oh, we
Andrews and
should
Milan,
probably just be clear, just for
yeah,
super clarity, the
yeah,
campus needed a benefactor. The college had been
merged.
merged with Emerson. So
That's
the
right.
campus, yeah.
Thank you for the clarity, because that's correct. But I think, you know, in a place of great need where there's not always someone who can like bankroll those sorts of things, in this case, this level of purchase with debt involved. And,
Mhm.
you know, I actually only know really what became public about the SIT World Learning situation with the
Mhm.
head of human resources. But if somebody can get away with moving over $400,000, I mean, I can't think of any head of human resources, even at a really major company I've worked at, who could have done that without anyone noticing. I mean, it's a big deal that that could happen before somebody got caught.
Mhm.
So, it does allow us to have some moments of reflection about what's happening culturally, that these things can happen or did happen.
Mhm.
Um, and the community, does have a role to play in that, not just individuals, but the community itself, and looking at whether or not we are maybe in a place where our needs are so great sometimes that we'll look the other way because our job or our local college or some institution that we care so much about is in need, and we want to see it succeed, so we don't ask all the questions, and we
Mm.
don't necessarily suss out all the things we need to, you know aka the transaction at Marlboro College that you and I both read, like the very first day that story came out. Remember,
Mhm.
you and I were talking on the phone and we were like, this has so many questions.
Mhm. But I think you raise a good question, or a good point about great need, and how we want our jobs or our institutions to survive. But I'm also curious, are we in Vermont just too trusting, or is there, because so many of our organizations are so small, we don't have the layers of oversight that maybe a larger company might have? Um, or is it something else? What's your thought on that?
Well, I mean, to be fair, corruption happens everywhere. People in a position of trust are, are compromised in many places all the time. And Vermont is obviously, a state that has these things happening too, where somebody is betraying a trust for private gain of some
Mhm.
kind to themselves. Um, it's really interesting. Like to me, the Seth Andrews story is very interesting in that I think you interviewed him, and we all had a sense of him and what he was trying to achieve. And people sometimes cut corners because they are trying to achieve a goal and they want to be the big man or big person who came in and like saved the community or resurrected the thing, or like, I mean, private gain doesn't necessarily need to be only about like, I needed a fancy car, right?
Mhm.
He
Mhm.
did have a fancy piece of real estate in Manhattan that was implicated, but um, his story was more complex than that.
Right.
His this idea of his goal and his mission, you know, is it that sometimes we tell ourselves that we really do want to do this great good, but we're going to cut these corners on the way in.
Mhm.
And I
Or
think,
because we're doing this great good, we deserve to cut the corners.
right, right. You think, on Wall Street, which, I will bring up because that's where a lot of my career was. Um, they'd always, all the crazy traders used to say, like, you have to steal your first fortune before you can make your real fortune. They were like, the first one's the crooked one, the second one's the real one. And their point was is you need money to make money. And if you don't have anything to invest, and that's really sad. But there are people who privately say that to each other and believe they need to find their little angle or their
Mhm.
way in. So just to answer your question about Vermont, I don't think it's that Vermont is we certainly don't have more people who are capable of this than any other place. I think it's probably the same in a
Mhm.
lot of places. We're all humans. We all have good and bad instincts. I will say that maybe sometimes because our needs are so great in this community, we may end up wanting something to be true, but it's too good to be true.
Mm.
And we talked about measuring corruption, and
Mhm.
I'm gonna dovetail that with what we wanted to say about a couple other frauds in this state.
Yeah.
But a great way to measure corruption, because it's hard to prove a lot of corruption, is if you see, for example, many police reports and many people saying they've reported wrongdoing or crime or whatever, and then very few convictions. So if you can look at the number of reports or situations that have evolved, and then you're seeing this very tiny fraction of it actually resulting in something, some kind of action taken.
Mm.
Things like that can help be a proxy for corruption, and that too many things are happening without enough action being taken.
Right.
And you can kind of stack numbers, look at them in opposition to each other, and make a case for why is there so much of this and so little of that.
Mhm.
And you can do that with any numbers for almost anything. Like
Mm.
if you want to make a logical case, that can be related to that's more about like crime versus conviction, but it could be a lot of things. Like, I'm not sure like what all the embezzlement cases that we've had have amounted to in terms of time in prison or fines, or did they pay the money back, or we had an issue in Brattleboro where, right, we had somebody who ran a company called Cultural Intrigue,
Mhm.
based in Brattleboro, and I believe his name was Adam Gebb. Is that right?
I think that sounds right, but I will double check that while you're talking.
I looked it up before this podcast just to make sure I had the name right, but I was pretty sure. Um, he had borrowed money from the town and then he left and fled to another country. And yeah, I'll use the word fled. That might not
You're
be
going
something.
there.
I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna say he fled, because he moved away so quickly after it was clear he needed to pay Brattleboro back, and it was like Brattleboro's out almost $70,000. Did he go to Ecuador? I feel
Yeah,
like
I
it was
believe
Ecuador.
so.
Yeah, and he kind of like blamed the collapse of his company on Amazon, but like he
Mhm.
really didn't address how he left Brattleboro high and dry. And, if he owed millions and millions to the town, which the town would not have put itself in that position, I don't think. But if that had
Mhm.
happened, I get it. He probably wouldn't be able to pay that back very easily. $70,000, he could try to pay that back. He could be paying installments on that if he wanted to. Um, he could do that. You know,
Mhm.
um, the the human resources director at World Learning who got into trouble had to pay back far more than that, and did when caught. So the idea that this person can't, or no, it's not that he won't.
Mhm.
Anyone can start to pay back something they owe, but I think, as you pointed out, a lot of different types of personalities may do something. And in this case, like he exploited a vulnerability, which was the town wasn't in a position to find some other way to get this money or be made whole.
Mhm.
Um, I think the last thing we wanted to talk about was Jay Peak, right?
Yes, and we have just over 5 minutes.
Okay.
Just doing a
Right.
time check. I know it went fast.
Very fast. Jay Peak, I just thought was really fascinating. And, there's a New Yorker article for those of you who haven't read it. A New Yorker article came out in the last couple months. I think it was this year. I think
Mhm.
it came out in early 2024. Could have been late 2023, but I think it was this year. And, the state has to pay $16.5 million back to investors in the JP project. And it's being called the Kingdom Con. And yeah, like, were we not very savvy? Did we go and have all these foreign investors, like dozens and dozens of foreign investors who sank their money into these amazing projects where we thought we were going to build, like Jay Peak and Burke Mountain and the Newport area up into something really substantial?
Mhm.
In the end, the prosecutors say this money was misused. It was, about 200 million estimated in foreign investment, and that it was, allegedly misused or stolen by the developers.
Mhm.
And the lawsuits claimed the state intentionally kept quiet, meaning Vermont may have kept quiet, allowing more investors to be defrauded so the construction projects that were already underway could continue and potentially be finished. And like, to me, that is, if that is even possibly true, then that would mean that we are putting the perceived needs of our communities in this state above what I would call, thoroughgoing, careful and vigilant transparency, and also monitoring. They were supposed to be checking the financials of a lot of this, the department in charge of this program
Mhm.
with the state, which is why the state is now being found at fault.
Right.
And that's just sad. And, we are all eager to build up our communities, but we're going to have to do it carefully and correctly. And if something starts to look off track, we can't just look the other way because we need, that parking lot built or that mall, put up, or that resort done.
Mhm.
We do have to face the music. If we want to play this game, if we want to have foreign investment of hundreds of millions of dollars, you got to be thoroughgoing. And, this is what the anti-corruption studies are all about, is how do you do that, but also have the community benefit.
Mhm. So, in the last few minutes that we have, I'd love to, if you can, share with us either some cultures or some structures that tend to be less vulnerable to corruption. I know before we were talking about hierarchies versus lateral
Mhm.
archies. I don't know what you would call them. Um,
Yeah, there is sort of a case to be made for, it's sort of a horizontal monitoring and transparency as opposed to something more vertical and hierarchical.
mhm.
So has been found in some studies is that if there's transparency among counterparties involved in anything where they can be checks and balances on each other and have roughly equal power in the situation or equal say, it's going to be a lot easier to catch corruption early and have somebody say, oh, hey, I question this, or can we check that?
Mhm.
It's a lot harder if you might have somebody who's a lower level person in an organization trying to blow a whistle on the top of the organization, because frequently that person will be ignored, or if it's a true problem, that person might end up being crushed or driven
Mm.
out because
Mhm.
they don't want to address the problem, or they don't want to address it yet. Um, or they're still trying to figure out what to do, but they need to quiet someone. And so it's found that it's the insiders in a situation who are in the best position to stop something from going wrong. By the time it becomes public, even if it's a public transparency like report or something,
Mhm.
by the time like a journalist like me catches it, this has now been going on for some time, I assure you. By the time somebody
Mhm.
like, journalists are outsiders by definition. We are
Right.
not the insiders. I'm not inside the corporation. I'm not inside the trading floor. I'm not inside the state office, or the
Right.
municipal center. I'm on the outside looking at the data. And so if I'm seeing bad problems with the data, you can bet the insiders already are aware of something's wrong. Um,
Mhm.
and so it's really those insiders monitoring each other that are the best line of defense against corruption. So we never
Interesting.
even hear about it.
Mhm. Mhm.
They'll nip it in the bud and that's it.
And along with, people kind of being on an equal level to monitor each other, are there other tips that an organization could institute to help prevent corruption?
I think that, one of the main things that we've talked about, if you have, um, if you have training and compliance in your organization and you really create a culture of, we do want to know, we do want to address, we do care, please come to us.
Mhm.
That there does need to be a true open door policy. And you can't really stop corruption without being transparent and encouraging people to come forward and to really listen to them. And, training matters in that people who are trained to be compliant and to understand the difference between, okay, this is out of compliance versus this is in compliance, what the difference is, what it really looks like, whatever the job may be. Um, it's not just financial compliance, it's cultural compliance and treating each other with respect.
Mhm.
And if somebody has something to report, actually genuinely having like a real process in place that's already pre-set that
Mhm.
this is going to go through. And ultimately, if you do have whistleblowers in your organization, it's well known in corruption studies that whistleblowers are almost always counterattacked, or almost
Mm.
always, there's an attempt to crush them, silence them, frequently fire them, make their lives difficult, or just, disparage them so that they don't continue. And that's something I kind of want to leave the audience with is, if you feel you need to do a whistle blow, you really want to think hard about, there is best practices for savvy whistleblowing. And the main thing is get all the information, find, find all the information you possibly can and never say a word about it, until you're all set to go. And then you can like file a report, or, a lot of whistleblowing from a criminal and regulatory standpoint. The first thing they'll ask if you report it like to a federal body or a federal agency or regulator is, did you tell the company, or did you
Mhm.
tell your organization or your manager? And if
Mhm.
your answer is no, well, that's kind of a crucial step. And so
Mm.
you have to really think about, do I have everything I need if I do need to go somewhere else? Because if you take that crucial step and then everything shuts down on you, you won't, somebody locks you out of your email, or
Right, right.
you don't have anything anymore. So it's terrible that you almost have to have this like mind of like, okay, assume the worst, but hope for the best. But and you also shouldn't try to blow the whistle or pursue something unless you feel very strongly about it. And ideally, it's something that affects more than just you, right?
Okay.
Just being angry about something yourself, if it doesn't affect others in the community or in the organization, do you really want to spend all your time on that? Do you want to give up your time? Do you want to get into a fight that could last months? Maybe abandon other opportunities that could be coming your way. Like, if this is just about having a vendetta, that really shouldn't be enough. Real whistleblowing should be about thinking about the group
Mhm.
or thinking about the community, um, doing good at the end, you know, and being constructive about a solution.
Thank you. That is all the time we have. Leah McGrath Goodman, thank you so much for joining us today. Do
Thank
you
you.
have a website, or if people want to learn more about the things you're working on, where they can go?
Oh, I do have something that I've recently started writing. It's called Column C on Substack, and C is for corruption. If you go to Substack and type Column C or my name, Leah McGrath Goodman, you can find it. I'm also on Twitter. My handle is at truth_eater.com. And well, it's at truth_eater. That's it.
Mhm.
And then my website is leahmcgrathgoodman.com if you want to find me, or you can drop me a note.
Fantastic. And as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2 and rebroadcast every Wednesday morning. Or you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Have a great weekend, everyone. Take care.
Bye.